the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath, dietary needs expert, certified meetings manager, certified food protection manager. I have searched the globe to find people and businesses who are creating safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences for their employees, guests, and communities. In each episode, you will find authentic conversations about how food and beverage impacts inclusion, sustainability, culture, community, health, and wellness. I know that sounds like a lot, but we're going to cover it all. Are you ready to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line? If so, let's go. Here at Eating at a Meeting, we talk all things food and beverage. With the experts in all things food and beverage. That includes farmers and doctors and caterers and eaters and everyone in between and abound. And today's guest is Johanna Mendelson Forman, who I actually heard speak about 4 or 5 years ago at the La Dames d'Escoffier annual convention in Washington, D.C. And she was talking about gastrodiplomacy and conflict cuisine. And it really intrigued me by how food and beverage plays into our society across the board, more than just going to the grocery store or to the farmer's market. She is a leading voice in the field of gastrodiplomacy and a leader in the Social Gastronomy Movement. She brings to the table years of experience as a policymaker on global conflicts and as an expert on making the connection between food and wars. Hi, Johanna.
Hi, Tracy. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
It's a nice afternoon, and I'm eager to talk to you.
Likewise.
It's really 4 or 5 years because I was really just starting this project, and a lot has happened. So we'll have lots to talk about.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize you had just started it back then. It was wonderful.
Yeah, I did. But I've learned a lot, and I've really moved to a lot of different related areas. So it's a good time to talk and recap.
Okay, great. So the first question that I want to ask you is, I kind of bring this topic up all the time when I'm doing talks, but how can we use the table as a tool for civil engagement? And what does that actually mean now that I'm asking you that?
Well, I think it's a very important question, and people reference it all the time. But, one thing is Franz Kafka said, we don't fight when we have food in our mouth. And coming around the table, the word in the trade is commensality because co means together and mensa in Latin means table, is one of the most ancient ways that people gather. And in these times when there's a lot of division and tension, you usually can sit around a table with a different group of people and not have as much of a fractious discussion. You can sit down and food becomes the way in which you relate. And that's very important. It's an equalizer. The table is not a divider.
That is so important. It brings that phrase of when you break bread with someone.
Exactly.
And you want that you welcome them into your home or into your event or wherever, and you want to treat them well with the food that you serve, no matter where you're from.
You're right. And even the word company, because you just talked about inviting people into their home, is again from the Latin, co, together, pan, bread, coming together around bread. So, all of these words have these connections with food.
That's really amazing. When I was reading, when you answered, you gave me the word commensality. I actually had to go look it up, and with the sharing at a table. And I love that. It is definitely something that we want to happen when we bring people together.
And even as recently, Stacey, as we just celebrated in some religions the Day of the Dead. Well, what do people do on that day? They bring food to their loved ones who are deceased. There are similar traditions in the Asian religions as well, but food has a very central place in sharing, whether you're dead or alive.
Well, that's so true. And even when people do pass away, you bring food to them so that they have comfort when they're dealing with their heartache and their other issues because they don't have time. So that's how we share, as we bring them food.
That's right. It's a very important part of multiple cultures.
Yes. So in the description that I provided everyone when we started was the word gastrodiplomacy. And can you explain what that means and the work that you're doing in that field?
Yeah, I think that it's important because people say gastro what when you tell them that. But I think we have to go back first to culinary diplomacy because the use of food as a tool in diplomacy is really ancient. It doesn't start with the French, although they'd like to claim it in the 18th century or 17th century, but it really starts in ancient times where food was used by the winners of wars to feed other people, often other armies, to co-opt them. Culinary diplomacy is today in the academic world what we call soft power. It's a tool of persuasion as opposed to hard power, which is the use of force or guns. So it has a very central place in the diplomatic toolkit. And all of us know about state dinners. We've all seen pictures of them. We know the bad things that happen at them, the good things that happen at them. But we know that they're very carefully orchestrated events, whom you sit next to, what wine you serve, what food, and the order of the menu, whether it's in the United States or in Europe. It doesn't matter. Culinary diplomacy is all part of this orchestrated diplomatic dance that people do with the ultimate goal of having a persuasive role in what they want to do, which is the food becoming a means to that end. Now, that gets me to gastrodiplomacy because culinary diplomacy is an act of government or royalty. It's a part of a state. Gastrodiplomacy is really about people, citizen food diplomacy. So you're a practitioner of gastrodiplomacy. I'm a practitioner of gastrodiplomacy. And it has two applications. More recently, governments have started branding their cuisines or their unique foods as a way to attract business and tourism. You've seen that. Tragically, COVID has put a stop to a lot of culinary tourism. But what we call middle powers, countries that are, they're not nuclear powers, they're not big countries, have launched very aggressive campaigns to promote their food. So Thailand is a very good example and one of the leaders in this area.
Really?
They started in the beginning of the 21st century, around 2006, something called the Global Thai Program, because they have a great cuisine, but it's a tiny little country. Most people do not travel to Thailand. And they decided we're going to help our expats, people who are Thais but live outside our country, open restaurants by giving them loans. And we'll give them loans to open these restaurants and share our food. So today you can go all over the world to the little corners. I was in Norway in Stavanger, which is a small city, and there was a Thai restaurant. Or you can be in a rural part of Germany and there's a Thai restaurant. Or you can be in Washington, which has a very different type of cuisine, and have a restaurant that was given this kind of grant. So it's a way of a government promoting a brand. It's not directly government, but it's branding. The Koreans have programs like this. The Indonesians have programs like this. The Mexicans have programs like this.
Wow.
And Peru has a very successful one, which they started in the mid-90s because they had great chefs, but they had also had a civil war. The Sendero Luminoso stopped tourism dead in its tracks. People were afraid to travel to Peru. And when the war was over and the political situation changed, they said, we've got to do something. And they said, let's brand ourselves as a tourist destination for food. And Peru remains in the Western Hemisphere the number one destination for people to travel to eat.
Wow.
So, and they have a big annual food festival for the Americas called Mistura. They didn't have it, unfortunately, this year because of COVID. But the point is, food has become a brand. Then there's the other part of gastrodiplomacy, which many of your listeners know about, which are food trucks or ethnic restaurants. And I use the word ethnic not as a derogatory term, but actually one of the good scholars on this, Crescendo Ray at New York University, says a food loses the term ethnic when it becomes American. How does it become American? Where people don't think about it as belonging to a certain culture. So pizza, for example, Or some German foods we eat. We don't think of them as German. We think of them as American. You think of a hot dog as an American food. It comes out of Germany. But the point is, ethnic food in the United States has a very important role because it helps cultures meet each other in communities. So we just had in Washington the National Pupusa Day. What's a pupusa? You probably know. It's like a tortilla stuffed with beans and meat and cheese. It's the dish of El Salvador. We have in Washington, D.C., I would say close to 100,000 people from the Central American wars that came and settled here. And pupusas are a snack food. My kids go and eat pupusas. They don't even understand the historic origin, but that's becoming generic. So what I'm saying is that food is a way we learn by our palates about other cultures when we don't travel. We certainly did before there were, jets to take us all over the world. Right. And we're going to do it again during COVID when all these restaurants who are trying to survive are promoting their very diverse cuisines. So that's a long-winded answer.
No, it's so interesting. And I love that phrase that you just said, we learn by our palates and what we like and what we don't like. But it also, what you were saying reminded me of a couple of years ago, there were a lot of articles on the refugees that were coming to the States or to other countries. And the way that they were putting themselves out into the community was sharing their food.
Exactly.
And I love it helped them ingrain themselves into the community, but also allowed the community to understand who they were.
Right. And there are several things, not only in the United States, but in Europe in 2015, when there was a terrible crisis of Syrians leaving Syria and crossing into Europe, food became the mechanism by which many of these people survived, because no matter what they were, it was often women who in the families, or often they had lost their husbands or they didn't have family any longer, who were cooking to survive, and they were setting up catering services and they were selling their foods. So food becomes the mechanism for survival. And that gets to social gastronomy, which is the other term you mentioned, because that's where it becomes the means towards social integration rather than the cooking being the end in itself. Right. And that is very important.
Well, and it reminds me also of a program in Atlanta, which I'm going to forget the name of it, but it's helping these women and men from other countries grow the food that they're from their countries that are indigenous there in Atlanta. So helping them and then selling it at farmers markets. So it's introducing, their crops and learning how to grow their crops that they're used to in a new environment, but then also sharing that and giving that to the community so they understand those crops as well.
That's so important because one, it provides them with something that they need to keep their cuisine alive. And on the other hand, it introduces new elements and tastes and flavors into the cuisines. In fact, this Sunday, the cover story of the New York Times was about Atlanta's Buford Highway. I once lived there.
Oh my gosh.
And Buford Highway is an emporium of all different cultures coming in.
Yes.
And it talks about different ethnic restaurateurs who are, of course, fighting to survive during COVID. But it once again shows how Atlanta has become this great melting pot in terms of cuisine. And Ethiopian food, which I lived in Atlanta in the late 1970s, and I mean, you could find grits and shrimp, and you could find all kinds of other wonderful Southern food, but you could never find an injera, or you could never find halal food at that point. Now it's widespread. So it diversifies ourselves. But I wanted to mention something since you mentioned refugees. The United States, of course, has had a bad record in the last few years on integrating refugees. But one of the things that is in the regulations for communities that take in refugees is that the community has to cook a meal that is a, quote, culturally appropriate meal. And communities, that means they have to, if they're Afghan, they have to learn how to make some Afghan stew so that people feel welcomed on their first meal. And it's in the regulations. And
Wow.
The proliferation of cookbooks. If you look at Amazon and just see how many cookbooks are out about refugee cuisines in the United States, I counted about 30 in the last 5 years.
Wow.
So there's this whole renaissance of cuisines from all over the world that have been revived as part of this refugee cuisine. And you and I, how do we learn how to cook something that's made in Afghanistan? Well, we have to have a cookbook.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have our mothers or our grandmothers or our aunties telling us how to do it. And many of these people carry their recipes in their heads. That's their cultural baggage, literally.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to learn through cookbooks.
That's so well, and it's it's always nice to pass down the recipe books from your grandmother or your great grandmother and things like that. But they're leaving their homes with a bag on their back, and that's it. And carrying some of those, it's not like they have them stored in Evernote to pull them up when they get
right. And in fact, I'm sure you know of this author. If you don't, Andrea Nguyen, who's a young Vietnamese American chef, talks about her grandmother leaving Saigon in 1975, getting out in the last helicopter. And what did she carry with her? She carried a notebook with recipes, and that became the basis of their restaurants. So food plays a central role, not only in livelihood creation for people, but also memory.
Yes.
I've been working in Turkey in the last 3 years with Syrian refugees and Afghan refugees and some people who come from Palestine and the Middle East. And we did a cookbook called The Cuisines of Life about food entrepreneurship. It's a beautiful cookbook, highly recommended. I'll send you the link for your website. But all of these recipes were from oral traditions. Nobody had a written recipe.
Wow.
And my co-editor, who's a Turkish woman, very talented, she had been Paula Wolfert's translator there. She and another colleague would sit there with cups and papers and measure every morsel of ingredients that these women use so they could recreate the recipes. And so, that in itself is a whole process, because when you've done it over and over and over again, you don't need it written down. You know how to do it.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, my uncle and I have been trying to figure out how my grandmother used to make succotash, and cannot for the life of us figure it out. It's not just throwing the bag in there, but she did something to it, probably a bunch of lard or something.
Probably lots of lard.
Yes. One of the quotes, well, you said it a few minutes ago, was the great equalizer, even when we live in times of so much division. And it's similar to a quote that it's much more deep than my quote that I get from James Beard, is that food is our common ground. It's our universal experience. And because we all have to eat, but that great equalizer when we live in times of so much division, just talking about COVID now, is that added division to the food system worldwide or locally?
Well, COVID is a whole separate topic for a separate show, really. But I mean, a quarter of the American workforce is involved in food in some way, whether it's cooking your meals or transporting it or doing the farming of it. So COVID had a dramatic and devastating effect on the food sector. But coming around the table, I mean, I've been to dinners that were during COVID on Zoom. So I attended early on an iftar dinner, a Muslim end of Ramadan, the day dinner, with people in Abu Dhabi and people in Chicago and people in New York. And we were each to prepare a dish for breaking the fast. And we had to video it. So, I mean, people have been doing things that are creative. Yes, it's hard. I would say it's not an easy thing, but people are going to have Thanksgiving virtually because the pandemic is making it very difficult for people to gather in groups or especially to travel.
Yeah.
But these are unusual times.
Mm-hmm.
But you talked about division and whether food bridges gaps. 4 years ago, there was a very interesting project called 100 Days, 100 Dinners. Do you remember that?
I remember hearing about it, but I don't know much about it.
Well, it was started by a Baptist minister and a young woman who was a grief counselor who had been using dinners to have a conversation with people who had similar types of losses.
Okay.
And they decided after the election that people were so sad and bitter about the results that they needed to get them together. And so 100 days, 100 dinners, where every community was to have 100 dinners and invite different people and have different recipes. And I attended two. I attended an early one, and then I attended a 100th dinner here in Washington.
Okay.
And it was remarkable because it had rules about, you can, what you say, this is a kind of a zone of peace. You're not going to be condemned. And it had facilitators at each table. And I thought it was a remarkable experience because it was very community driven. And I think that's very much something that food does.
Mm-hmm.
That you can drop your animosity, or you can agree to disagree, but you are still doing it in an environment which is familiar, which is eating.
Right. Yeah, that's very true. The one of the things that I remember you saying, and I'm going to paraphrase this, but also what you quoted too, is that it's a weapon of war. And you said it earlier. So, and when COVID, and this is not really war, but COVID at the very beginning of it, I forgot who it was, but they were talking about rice. And they're like, unless you've already pre-ordered, we're not exporting any rice to anywhere else in the country, into the world. So it, was limiting people from potentially getting the food that they typically have. So can you go explain how it has been used as a weapon?
Food has been used as a weapon of war. Withholding food from populations is very ancient. This is not a new phenomena. What you're talking about with COVID is that it proved that we are no longer, despite everybody supporting local agriculture and local foodways, we are a globalized food economy. And developing countries and developed countries alike are equally dependent on a global delivery of food systems. So that's something that COVID laid bare and is creating a lot of thinking. You're not going to go grow rice here in Virginia in spite of people's desire to have rice. You get rice from Asia or from Vietnam. And what's very interesting, rice is the number one cereal consumed in the world. Wow. And it's very important all over, particularly in Asian cultures, but here too. Rice grows in the Carolinas in the United States, and some of it we get from there. But in fact, the bulk of rice that you get comes from global markets. It's not grown in the United States. Now, to get to your question on a weapon of war, it's against humanitarian law to withhold food from civilians in war. It's against the humanitarian laws for soldiers who are prisoners of wars not to be fed. And yet it's one of the easiest ways for control. And more recently, if you look at conflicts that are going on in the world, the war in Syria is a civil war, but the way that the government is trying to get people who are dissidents to, toe the line is by withholding food in those communities or cutting off food lines. Same thing happens in Yemen, which has one of the worst starvation situations in the world, where two factions have their food lines cut off and literally millions of people are starving to death. And war is, doesn't have to be waged by one country against another. It can be in a civil war situation of non-governmental actors who control food. So it's still a major problem in the 21st century in a world where we thought the Green Revolution would end hunger and open up food for everybody. And we do have enough food on the planet for people, but we don't have a distribution system that will allow that. So when you have an upheaval like a pandemic, you just throw everything out the window and you're stuck in a terrible situation.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. It brings so many different concepts and things to think about, because when you go to the store and you buy, we'll just go back to rice, Uncle Ben's rice, which I think they're changing the name, right? you don't think about everything that went into that
Right.
to get that box of rice to you in your grocery store. And there's hundreds of boxes in the grocery store, or even your bananas, where we're not growing bananas in North Carolina, at least not that I know of.
Well, I think the global food chain is interesting. When you teach students about international relations and you ask them to pick a food off the shelf and tell them where it's come from, 9 times out of 10, it isn't coming from your local, farmer. Right. It's coming from someplace across the globe with large carbon footprint. And I think what's one of the nice features of a lot of the revitalizations of cities has actually been these aerial farms and indoor aquaculture farms where people are starting to grow lettuce and herbs and in old warehouses. One of the biggest greens growers in the Northeast is in Newark, New Jersey, in an old factory. I mean, they have 10 stories of lettuce growing.
Wow.
So Aerofarms is the name of the company. But the point is, it's happening all over the world as people recognize, one, repurposing urban areas. It's good business. And two, having the distance between what you eat and what you grow shortened is important in terms of feeding local areas. It's an energy saver as well.
Right.
So there's just a lot of creativity, I think, that's happening in the food space.
Yeah, I agree. And there's 2 farmers that I shop for at the New Bern Farmers Market. And one is he's a single farmer, young kid, under 30, working on his grandmother's farm, or he made it into a farm on his grandmother's land, and he works by himself. And then there's the farm at Bogue Farm, and they're doing hydroponics. And it's the food. And I just had some kale from them the other day, and oh my gosh, it's so fresh and so delicious. And not that, and so is Stevens. He's growing them in the ground, but they both have different issues in how they manage their food. But I think they're both equally good, but I know where they're from. They're within 30 minutes of my house.
Well, I think that is something that's, going to increase. There's a great consciousness, especially among the Gen Xers and also among the Zoomers, as they call the Gen Xers and the Gen Z, who are very conscious of what they eat and where they eat it from. But if you're living in a developing part of the world, first of all, your farmer is probably going to be a woman, and her problem will be getting enough seeds and fertilizer to be able to survive and then to get a crop to market. So we have these great disparities, just like we talk about inequality in the United States. The inequality of the food system is really the challenge of overcoming that, so everybody eats in a planet that is truly abundant.
Right.
And go ahead.
No, I was going to say, now that question escaped my brain. We are abundant, and we just have to figure out how to, protect the food that we have. And kind of bringing COVID up again is, at the very beginning, I was hearing all the farmers, tilling their crops back into their land or pouring out the milk. And there's this industry that I'm in with convention centers and hotels with these large kitchens that could actually take the food from the farmers and can it and use their kitchens. And, unfortunately, they had no staff. They had to lay all their staff off. But we have the means by which to do it. But it also requires, revenue coming in to pay the people that are going to go do that, and figuring out, reconfiguring our food system and how it gets to people.
Yeah, I think that's one of the challenges and problems that COVID laid bare, but people are solving it. For example, when the school lunches and breakfasts were cut off because kids were not going to school, a lot of these people who were caterers or people who made the food transformed their own places into these distribution centers so that people could still pick up a lunch and a breakfast for their kids.
Right.
I know even in nearby Baltimore, I'm in Washington, D.C., a friend of mine who runs a beautiful high-end restaurant has converted her kitchen to allow refugee women who were cooking for the farmers market to become a place to, make meals for schools. So lots of this is happening all over the United States. And the question is, it was funded by some of the federal relief money. And the challenge will be, how do you let this continue? Right. Hopefully, when we are out of this period, but there's still a need. It doesn't eliminate the need. There's a lot of hungry people in this country as we come towards Thanksgiving, and that has to be resolved.
Right. Definitely. One of the questions that I asked pre-coming on here was, what does safe, inclusive, and sustainable food and beverage experiences mean to you?
Well, it's a tough question. Sustainable to me means that it meets the needs of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is no hunger. Mm-hmm. And part of the problem, again, getting back to COVID, is that the goal of ending global hunger by 2030 has now really been determined by the World Food Program and the Food and Agriculture Organizations to not be achievable, because this epidemic has set us back so far. I think we'll make it maybe by 2035, but in the last 3 years, the number of hungry people in the world has actually increased after decades and decades of reduction. So sustainability means the ability to feed people and to be able to give people access, which is the old definition of food security. Mm-hmm. But also, I think, to be able to reduce waste, which is very, very important. And there's a growing awareness of food waste, but still not enough in my view. And waste has to be connected to climate change, because at the end of the day, food is part of the whole climate change dilemma. Food landfills, if they were a country, according to this drawdown project, would be the third largest country in terms of greenhouse gas emissions.
Exactly.
So to me, sustainability is finding ways to reduce that emission and at the same time repurposing food. You're probably familiar with the ugly fruit movements of people who take vegetables and fruits that aren't pretty, but they're perfectly edible, and using them. We just have to have a lot more of this, and that takes education.
Yes. Because when you put that ugly tomato in a Vitamix, you never knew that it was ugly.
I make my gazpacho with ugly tomatoes, and they're perfectly delicious. So
they are.
The point is, I think it's a process where we've made perfection through corporate type of agriculture. And I'm not against corporate agriculture, but the sense that everything has to look the same and taste the same is that it really doesn't. And a lot of the people, the younger students who started some of these movements, I give them tremendous credit for doing it, but it's a long road.
It is. Okay, so that question that I forgot a long time ago, or not a long time ago, but how does regulations in each country impact, because we've got, different labeling laws or different, import and export regulations around the world. How does that impact, the global market of insecurity?
Well, labeling is more of a developed country phenomena. Okay. And the European Union has some of the toughest standards on labeling, right? Much tougher than the United States. But, there are challenges all over the world with the security and safety of food. We know that there have been issues with food coming in from China because of the regulatory, inconsistencies. So, yes, it's a very serious and important issue. But as far as sustainability, people who learn how to cook also take hygiene and sanitation courses. And that's a big step forward. They recognize that food safety is part of food security.
Well, and which brings another term to my mind is food fraud, because you hear, honey coming, it's, it says it's not from here, or it's from here, but it's actually from China, or even Italian olive oil. It says it's from Italy, but it's actually from somewhere else. I know saffron is one of those, and I think coffee is on the top 10 list. How can we combat that?
Well, that's an important and difficult question. It's a regulatory issue. One of the things that's happened in the United States is we have cut back on inspectors in the United States Department of Agriculture. That's why we have a whole food inspection service that is supposed to look at things coming over on ships and on air cargo to see that what's in the container is what's supposed to be. So we need to create jobs around people who can enforce food safety regulations, even in our slaughterhouses. And we don't have that many. We rely on very few slaughterhouses in the United States for our meat products. If you don't have inspectors, you have all kinds of issues that arise. So that, I think, is a phenomena of deregulation in the developed world. And in the underdeveloped world, it really is a matter of, electricity access. Do you have refrigeration? Cold chain? Are things kept cold, which are incredibly important?
Right.
So it's, a serious issue, especially when products are going around the world.
Right. Okay. Well, we're coming up to the end to our 30 minutes. So how can people find out more about what you're doing? And I'm interested also in the curriculum that you're also teaching. I know you teach at American University, but it sounds like there's more curriculum elsewhere as well.
Well, there are two things I can refer you to, and I'd be happy to send you. I assume you put this on a website.
Mm-hmm.
Is one, I have a website, which is conflictcuisine.com.
Mm-hmm.
And I also am part of a project which is called the LIFE Project, which is Livelihood and Food Entrepreneurship, which published a cookbook, which is available on Amazon and also in the Europe on a very interesting site called CKBK, which is a cookbook site which sells cookbooks and posts recipes for sale. And I guess, that you can find these things. My writings are on the website at American University. So there are lots of places, but as I say, I'm one of a legion of people who are taken by the changes in chefs and what's going on as activists. And it's a positive step forward in our own country of rethinking how the food system works.
Well, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate your time and what you're doing in this gastrodiplomacy world that more and more of us need to understand. And, in the meetings industry, just in the US, meeting planners spend $54 billion a year on food and beverage. And that was pre-COVID, of course. But with that being our spend, I feel like we do have a greater responsibility in creating gastrodiplomacy in a variety of different ways, being concerned about where we're ordering our food from and who we're partnering with to prepare it, and understanding who's attending our events.
Right. Well. And it's interesting. I've attended meetings and participated in meetings at conventions here in Washington where we've actually offered a menu of different ethnic foods so people could sample them, because Washington doesn't have one cuisine, although this has always been to me a very southern city. But the cuisine of Washington is the cuisine of all the people who've come here. There was once this congressman, you must remember him, White Fowler of Georgia, who then became a senator. And he always said, you could tell where America was at war by what restaurants opened in Washington. And that's actually become the trademark of the city. We are so diverse that you can eat the globe basically in our city. And I think that's a very positive thing for young students to learn, because often they don't have that. And it's a good thing for people in your business to learn as well.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, on that note, what is your favorite food to eat?
Oh, I'm just a big New York pizza lover, I have to say. And it's very hard to get it anywhere but New York. It always saddens me. But I know that sounds, I love Turkish food, although there's more access to it here. But, food is very dynamic. Yes. So even if there's something you enjoyed in Istanbul or in Izmir, you'll never have it taste the same way because we don't have the access to all the ingredients. And I always get calls about Aleppo pepper, and I have to tell people when the National Geographic called me, said, "Oh, there's a war in Syria." I said, Aleppo pepper is a generic pepper that grows in this region between Turkey and Aleppo, Syria, because it was part of the Silk Road. So yes, you can get Aleppo pepper, but if you talk to someone in Turkey, you said, "Oh, Gaziantep pepper, that's what you really want." So it's like Burberry in Ethiopia. People are very protective of what they have, but in fact, these peppers and spices, are hard to come by these days.
Right. Exactly.
But they make the difference in the taste.
They do. Yeah. And, and spices are so important to the flavor of food. People take that for granted, I think.
Absolutely. But still, when you make something, no chef makes the same dish the same way. Just go to a Chinese restaurant and you'll notice how different they are. So, I think that's part of the beauty, is that food is continually changing.
Mm-hmm. And that re-emphasizes the melting pot that the United States is as well. It takes me back.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I love that. So, well, again, thank you so much for your time. I will share all of the links that you mentioned with all of our listeners and viewers of this show. And thank you, everyone, for listening in to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath, and I am gracious. It was so gracious of you to spend time with me today, Johanna. And I look forward to learning more from you and about gastrodiplomacy.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. A nice conversation, and I look forward to many more.
Likewise.
Thanks for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where every meal matters. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, your food and beverage inclusion expert. Call me and let's get started right now on creating safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences for your customers, your employees, and your communities. Share the podcast with your friends and colleagues at our Eating at a Meeting Facebook page and on all podcast platforms. To learn more about me and receive valuable information, go to tracystuckrath.com. And if you'd like more information on how to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line, then visit eatingatameeting.com.